Hello, my name is Sean Mooney, and I am Managing Director and Chief Curator of the Rock Foundation, an organization created in 1976 by Edmund Carpenter and Adelaide de Menil for the purpose of overseeing and sharing with the public their extraordinary collections of Native American, Oceanic, and other indigenous arts, and to support scholarship in these fields. Today, the Foundation also serves to disseminate their authored works and intellectual properties. I have had the privilege of working with them both since 2002. Anthropologist Edmund Snow Carpenter, commonly known as Ted by his friends, was born in Rochester, New York on September 2, 1922, and this talk is the first in a series of events that will celebrate his life and work in his centennial year 2022. By way of a brief introduction to Ted Carpenter, I would like to point out a few of the many contributions he made to the field of visual anthropology. Carpenter began his career as a teenager, working as an amateur archaeologist with staff of the Rochester Museum of Science, and received his undergraduate and graduate degrees from the University of Pennsylvania, where he worked under anthropologist Frank Speck. In 1947, after serving in the Marines during World War II, Carpenter took a professorship post at the University of Toronto, where he met the colleague who would be a lifelong friend, Marshall McLuhan. Through the 1950s, Carpenter and McLuhan co-edited the landmark journals Explorations, Studies in Culture and Communication, which laid the foundation of what would become the so-called Toronto School of Communication Theory. During those years, Carpenter performed fieldwork in the Canadian Arctic, wintering with an Evelik Inuit family in 1950-51 and again in 1953-54. The head of the family was named Ohuenewek, or Harry Gibbons, who became Carpenter's chief informant, interpreter, and friend. Carpenter lived with the family in traditional sod houses and igloos, rather than the modern wooden village houses used by Canadian settlers and other outsiders. These experiences in the Arctic guided his thinking for the rest of his life, leading to innovative concepts of literacy, visual and non-visual perception, and also a highly intimate and humanistic approach to anthropology. Ohuenewek died suddenly in 1954, an event that moved Carpenter deeply and committed him to exploring his profound Arctic experiences further. Here at the upper right, we see a still from an unfinished film Carpenter began in the early 1950s, in which Ohuenewek's hand appears, holding a group of tiny objects created by the pre-Inuit Dorset culture almost 2,000 years ago. It was in the context of celebrating his lifelong dedication to studying the Arctic that I first met Carpenter in 2002 as a collector of perhaps the finest known assembly of Paleo-Eskimo Old Bering Sea carvings in walrus ivory presented at the exhibition Upside Down Les Arctiques at the new Musée de Quai Branly in Paris, 2008. Here we see some images from his collection and the installation in Paris, in which we included Carpenter's restored Arctic film, especially featuring the hand of Ohuenewek projected onto the floor. The exhibition was later reconfigured and installed at the Menil Collection in Houston in 2011. Carpenter's work with McLuhan led him to move to California in 1958 to found the Experimental Anthropology Film Department at the Cal State University at Northridge, where he influenced scores of new filmmakers working in the fields of anthropology and other disciplines.
Newton did far more than record that an apple is drawn to earth by gravity. He guessed that the same gravity which reaches to the top of a tree goes on reaching out beyond the earth, endlessly into space, and holds the moon in her orbit.
That film clip is from a film that Ted worked on called College, about college, sort of a promotional film about the Cal State Northridge campus, and features Vincent Price as the voiceover, and musician Fred Katz did the score. Anyway, in 1969, Carpenter left Northridge and found himself as far away from the Arctic as anyone might expect, to the Sepik River in Papua New Guinea, where the Australian government had hired him to study the effects of new media on the native populations. Using film, sound recording, and photography, Carpenter directly engaged the native communities by giving them this equipment to use themselves, as well as recorded the reactions of villagers experiencing this technology for the first time. To execute this project, Carpenter brought with him a collaborator who would later become his wife, photographer Adelaide de Menil. Many of you are aware that the Menil Collection in Houston is home to one of the largest collections of surrealist art in the United States. Carpenter was instrumental to the guidance of the museum's collection, casually advising his mother-in-law, Dominique de Menil, on points of presentation, selection of artworks, and most especially the inclusion of non-European and indigenous art seen in context with surrealist and other works. A large majority of the collections of Native American and oceanic material cultures presented in the Menil Collection today were originally placed there by Ted and his wife Adelaide, and in 1999, Carpenter installed the permanent exhibition Witnesses to a Surrealist Vision, which features wildly juxtaposed objects and subjects in a whimsical, surrealist bedroom type of environment within the heart of the surrealist galleries of the museum. Carpenter's presentation and selections for the Witnesses Room reflects the sorts of objects surrealist collectors themselves obtained and studied, and some of the works on view had once, in fact, belonged to Max Ernst, André Breton, Roberto Matta, and other surrealists, or were very similar to ones they had collected. Rather than speaking too thoroughly on the Witnesses installation, I'd like to share with you some brief clips of Carpenter himself speaking during the installation of Witnesses in 1999.
Now, this is a death mask which is made up of crosses. And there's a bib that goes down here, it's the same thing. And on top of this, we're putting a hat, a French hat, in the woman's hat, in the shape of a human hand. And the point here of juxtaposing these things is that the surrealists collected ethnographic art, but they didn't bundle it by culture area. They were not interested in history, in culture, in chronology, in function. They were interested in juxtaposing these things to see if there were any patterns that connected, if there were any analogies to be found there. They were interested in the chance encounter, not the systematic thing. This is where anthropologists and have often totally misunderstood what the surrealists were doing. The anthropologists say an object takes its value from the culture that produced it, that it has no value outside of that. Well, the surrealists go beyond that. They say that it may contain within itself elements that will declare itself. Now, it's no accident that structuralists in anthropology accepted that pattern as well. Claude Lévi-Strauss. And all these far-reaching examples that he was prepared to put side by side, fully aware of the fact that there was no historical connection between them. And he didn't argue that. He didn't launch Buddhist priests paddling across the Pacific, any of that nonsense, none of this Kon-Tiki silliness. But on the contrary, he said that there could be elements at work here. And the most basic one that he came up with was that the human brain is an electronic organ that operates on the basis of plus or minus, like a computer, yes or no, back and forth, and that the coexistence of contraries, the unity of opposites, is not a genetical factor, it's a function of the brain. And that all of these forms contain within themselves, it's Niels Bohr's famous comment that a profound truth is a truth whose opposite is equally true. Now, the surrealists understood this. It's fascinating to me that they independently took this. They didn't turn to science and try to imitate scientists. No. They independently arrived at these same conclusions. It seems to me that surrealism is really the 20th century's main art form. It's not pretty art. It's not impressionist art. It's not Matisse. It's not the sort of thing you would like to have in your dining room, sort of thing. It's often disturbing, but it mirrors the scientific discoveries of the 20th century and parallels them dead on. It's really the art of the 20th century. Now here we have objects that the surrealists were fascinated by, and this was primarily a French effort in the mid-19th century. These were toys, and they were given wonderful names. This is a phantasmagoria, and this is a camera obscura, and this is a zoetrope, and a praxinoscope, and so forth. But the whole point was to try to make these forms come to life, to move, to have depth, to speak, to take off. And they would combine different toys in this way for light shows. And some of these were quite large, including automatons that would be life-size, actors that would come on stage, and they would have a screen there and have shadow plays, and then they would project through an aquarium and reverse things and drop chemicals in. And some of the chemicals, if they reversed the image, the chemicals would grow up, and or they would go down, and animals would go, fish would float by, greatly enlarged, and then men wearing masks, let's say with a sword or something, would come out, and in this reverse imagery, they'd stab the fish, and the fish would race away. And these must have been remarkable shows. In 1869, a man named O.B. Brown in Malden, Massachusetts, I don't know why I remember these dates and his name and everything, but he combined the phantasmagoria. He said he had married two toys. He combined the phantasmagoria with a phenocinoscope. And that provided, you see, the shutter mechanism. Then he took from a zoetrope one of these complex images and dipped it in oil, whale oil, from the phantasmagoria, and he used a sprocket mechanism, and that is your first movie projector. This is from Easter Island. The surrealist, it's a lizard man. they were particularly interested in Easter Island. As a matter of fact, when they drew a map of the world, Africa became a tiny place, but Easter Island became almost the size of Africa. And they emphasized New Guinea and Alaska. They emphasized the Soviet Union because they were, in the 1920s, some of them were interested in Marxism. But by and large, they focused on those areas of the world where they could obtain visual puns. And those areas were New Guinea, Easter Island, Northwest Coast, and above all, Alaska. Well, this is the Mata box, and it was first displayed in Barcelona, I think about 30 years ago. The 6 panels on the outside all depict war, violence, carnage. The inside panels remain unknown to us. The box is sealed, and Mata did not disclose the contents of the inner panels. When it was displayed, people were encouraged to predict what they thought those panels would contain, and they entered this in a notebook there. It's typical of the surrealists that they would be interested in the unseen, the invisible, and they were interested in invisible art and in silent music and in motionless dance with silent music. For example, some of these musical instruments that we have are placed against the body so that you experience them as vibration. At the top here, you'll see 3 visual puns. In the first one, you have a rabbit and a duck. And the question is it possible to see both simultaneously, or must you alternate between one and the other? And according to Wittgenstein, it's impossible to perceive without conscious awareness. And but to me, the question goes beyond that. Is it possible to see this as simultaneously duck and rabbit? That is, in a spirit form. It's the sort of thing that the surrealists enjoyed, but native groups often did it to much greater ease. For one thing, they had hundreds of generations behind them doing it. Became immensely sophisticated. I've seen up to 3 and 4 images simultaneously presented, in which every line serves every image. I think we've covered just every piece here.
Maybe we did.
Well, unless it would be these junk over here.
Oh, yes.
These are souvenirs and fakes. And the surrealists, at the beginning, had neither money nor expertise. And they bought in junk shops and they bought in flea markets. And they ended up with many pieces that were not the best. They then later turned to dealers, and particularly to museums. They acquired their great collections when they were in the United States, where they found that the most diverse objects could be had in the most unlikely places. Breton's widow told me that they had no money, and when they would check into a hotel or rooming house, she would have to go up and determine that there were no bed bugs and that the place was reasonably sanitary. But he wouldn't wait. He wanted to go out and just roam the streets and go from one junk shop to another. In the brief period from 1940 to 1945, when they were in the United States, principally in New York, they amassed most of their collections. They took them back with them to Europe. There are some remarkable pieces here. I think one of the great advantages here is this show is a collection of surrealism is perhaps unparalleled. At the same time, it's very formal, and it's to be taken quite seriously. This is to be taken seriously, but it's much more relaxed. It's sort of a wow sort of thing. Anyway, so.
Do you have any, is that your concluding remark? Or do you have any?
No, I don't. No, I'm just going to wait and see. We're going to wait and see if people come back and if they become what they learn from it. We'll see. And maybe what we will learn from it. So, anyway.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.